Team leader and business owner, he is also known to his employees, team members, and customers as simply II. It was a nickname he picked up while serving in the Navy. The legend goes that all men whom encountered him were afraid he might become angry, thus many were agreeing with him before he ever barked an order. Thus he became known as II, a term used and that is still used today to convey confirmation and agreement. II and his team remain available for hire to do anything required, assuming you can pay their price. They are very similar to the A-Team, except this A-Team has a revolving player list that is very deep in talent for that kind of work, which these men are most often paid to do. These guys are not for the family hour. They hit everything that they aim at to kill. If you are seeking comp ex-military, these are your guys. When describing their leader, the best example to give might be the current day Jesse Ventura. II has the silver hair and is every bit as big as Jesse. II did not seek the limelight, would be the biggest difference between them. Much of the stuff that II had a part in his past is still classified even today. Suffice it to say that in the circles which he ran, he is definitely a legend. This is much more than a 5-man black op team. It is a congregation of what their peers would possibly agree are the best fighting men in the world retired. All of II's team members are people whom no longer have any official attached loyalty, though it is clearly understood that whatever branch of whatever service they formerly served will remain an area of loyalty for them for their lifetime. Nobody is asking anybody to turn against their former country or military branch. This is simply a place for such men to go in retirement where they can find excitement when they want and otherwise have others of similar background to exchange stories and adventures. As often as not these days, their kill assignments are for 4-legged critters rather than the 2-legged kind. Those operations are done by younger men. It doesn't mean that II and his team are out of the game. It just that for the price that they charge, many younger men are willing to work for less. II's prices are often non-negotiable, though again, like the A-Team, he charges on a sliding scale based on what you can afford to pay. Most times, however, the client is more than capable of paying the price. When they're not on a mission, they kill time by helping out the environment in Florida. Specifically, they hire out to kill the 2 worst invasive species in Florida. The pythons, which are invasive and wiping out the native predators, and the wild pigs, which are also running rampant in every county of the great state of Florida. There is literally no rules at all about how you can go about killing these invasive pests, short of you can't use poison or some other means which might spill the killing over into other species. Even explosives are not out of the question for these ex-military mercs. That won't be found anywhere in writing, but nobody bats an eye at how these men get their job done because they are complete professionals. They take no chance a civilian can get hurt and will quickly abort any mission at the first sign of a civilian interaction. The men fully understand the stakes of their game, and that is why they are allowed to operate with such an unfettered approach. One mistake, and it likely all would go away. That is understood and accepted. The team have been doing this for over a decade and so far without incident, which, by the way, is why you haven't heard of them. For men who regularly use and need to practice with automatic weapons, this is an almost ideal circumstance. II managed to get a deal with the Florida authorities to get a salary rather than by the item bounty because, as he pointed out, when his men start missing, they won't be around very long to collect. And what he meant by that was when they would go on their next mission against armed enemies, those that do not shoot accurately do not live long. He further pointed out that his men recognized the need to practice in order to stay sharp. And he finished his pitch by pointing out that they would work on a salary basis if they didn't have to collect all the bodies and haul them in for the bean counters to do their job. He figured that was the majority of the work, so if he was paid even half of the usual bounty, then his team would be way ahead of the game. His team kept track of a week's worth of kills. Only wild pigs and big snakes were sought, but naturally there were times when the team would surprise other creatures. They hunted at night because it was summer and because the wild pigs were much easier to stalk in the dead of night due to the use of night vision. Silencers, automatic weapons, many cutting edge, plus the use of modern-day booby traps, and then applying strategies such as attacking from downwind and setting up their booby traps along the obvious escape paths used by the pigs. Most of the traps had to be rigged to kill something that was only about 2 feet tall instead of 6, but that didn't take a lot of extra time. If you were worried about other animals running into the booby traps, it seldom happened, and almost never did a bigger animal get caught in one. The team understood that there are 2 paths. The one going at an angle up or down a hill will be the one that the deer and their kind use. The wild pigs travel straight up and down. The 2 kinds use different paths. On a really good night, I and his team averaged about 6 pigs a man. Piglets were routinely killed but never figured into the body count, and they still averaged 6 pigs a man. That was with a 10-man team. 6 men launched the initial attack, and the other 4 were stationed along the escape routes. Many of these were huge adult male and female pigs. Collecting and hauling their bodies would have been a chore. Instead, they were left for the native predators to enjoy. As for killing the snakes, the best chance for finding them was when they were gathered to mate. Pythons enter into an orgy of intertwined bodies, one female and the rest are male. It creates what they call a ball, which can be spotted across the field using various means, which include simple binoculars to the use of infrared. Apparently the snakes are prone to being easier to spot at night using the infrared than other means. On a good night they might spot 5 balls. Averages were more like 3. Still, when you took into consideration the size of the snakes they were killing, it was hard to argue that they weren't making a difference. No strategy is used to kill the snakes. They're not aware of what's going on at any distance further than 10 meters, give or take. As such, when a ball is spotted, a couple of the men are dispatched to kill the entire ball. It was during one of those simple search and kill operations that 2 of II's men saw the Bigfoot. Perhaps a better term for Florida would be to use the term skunk ape. According to those that claim to know, the Sasquatch found in Florida and other southern locations are perhaps 2 feet shorter than their northern cousins. Most descriptions of the skunk ape give a height of 6 to 7 feet. There are regular reports in Washington State and Canada of Sasquatch which reach 10 feet or more. Despite being shorter, or perhaps because of being the shorter version of the Sasquatch, are said to be considerably more aggressive. Maybe they have that same complex that shorter male human beings sometimes exhibit, where they are quicker to be ready to battle, which some believe is because they are trying to make up for their smaller size. The 2 men who had been dispatched to kill the ball of pythons left the other 8 men who were getting ready to wrap things up for the night. It had been an extremely fruitless night, which was nobody could ever remember having endured in the past. Sure, they had nights when they had been rained out. Extreme weather was always a reasonable excuse for bad hunting. This night, however, had none of that. It was warm, cloudless, with the slightest of breezes. It should have been a good night. Despite all indications they would have a great night hunting, the team never saw so much as or heard so much as of a wild pig rustling in the underbrush. There was actually very little to wrap up that early morning, as the sun was just starting to send out its golden-colored scouts, announcing that its arrival would be coming soon. The 8 men were all standing around waiting on the other 2 to start firing their automatic weapons when they suddenly heard one of the men shout out in terror. The 8 men sprung to action quickly, grabbing extremely bright floodlights and aiming them in the direction of the 2 men. What they first saw were the 2 men running back toward them at breakneck speed. One of the 2 men didn't even have his rifle in his arms. He had obviously dropped it at some point. One of the 8 men who was manning one of the floodlights began to move his light beyond the 2 men who were racing back to join the rest of the team. His beam of light reached out across the flat landscape and briefly illuminated something tall, very tall, covered in dark fur or hair, and in its hands were 2 huge pythons. The light's path only illuminated the scene for the briefest of seconds before it had passed by. The light operator stopped the progression of the light and hesitated for just a split second before he quickly had the light back on that very tall, very hairy beast. And now they could see it also was very stout. Wrapped around each one of its thick arms were the giant pythons. Further viewing revealed the beast had the snakes by their heads, and the snakes were wrapped around its mighty arms in a defensive move, the last desperate act of two of nature's most mightiest predators who were obviously losing their battle. I noted it seemed that there was an argument as to whom held the title of apex predator in this location. Suddenly, the mighty beast roared back its head and let go a roar which seemed to have strength even when it reached the now 10-man team. The two who had been running back were now with I and the others. Though certainly impressed, the 10-man team had been to many rodeos, they stood unflinching. Armed to the teeth, the 10 men began to flank out and get into an attack position. I announced that nobody was to fire unless he gave an order or their life was in peril. Yes, they had a good idea of what was out there, holding those two big snakes like they were nothing more than a slight inconvenience turned tasty snacks. Still, this was a creature standing on two legs. How was it going to look if they shot it? People love Bigfoot. Hell, there are a couple states which made it illegal to bother or harass Bigfoot, even though it officially doesn't exist. I was nobody's fool. You don't get far with public opinion turned against you, especially the military types. They watched as the big beast took a bite out of one of the snakes and then turned and began to move away from the 10-man team, which had fanned out into a half circle. They no longer had the big lights on the creature. Each had opted to go with lights that attached to their automatic weapons. The 10 separate light sources searched the darkness for signs of the huge beast, but they found nothing except the remains of the snake ball when they got to it. A few of the snakes were still living, which the team quickly dispersed. IA gave the order to retreat. The team moved back to their transport in their usual military manner. They covered their flanks and their six, but there was no need. The big beast had left the location, or so it seemed. II appeared content with this outcome. So did the majority of the men. In fact, they all were in agreement after the boss pointed out that many downsides, which many have been experienced had they decided to hunt and kill this beast. He took the time to address the matter because when you are dealing with men of such a battle-driven history, they do not easily accept a loss. In fact, it is a fair assumption that the major reason the men did not pursue the beast was because they understood the importance of public opinion. So far, they had stayed out of the public view. That was good. What was bad was to be suddenly thrust into public view over such an instance of having killed a Bigfoot. Back at their hotel room, the team concluded what they had seen was a Florida skunk ape, aka Bigfoot. Apparently, the big fellow also hunts the invasive pythons. It was very impressive to see one of the beasts stand up on 2 feet while holding those meaty arms out, which I think he was probably done to prevent the snakes from being able to wrap around his head. Then watching as the beasts popped their big serpent heads with a squeeze of each of its powerful hands, and then seeing those hugely thick bodies which were wrapped around the Sasquatch's arms suddenly go from rigidly braced to crush what they had wrapped around to becoming loosely hanging decorations. It was remindful of garden hoses that had been draped around a man's arms, only these had a snake skin instead of the usual green hue, and were, of course, about 20 times bigger around in circumference than any garden hose ever dreamed of being. All that happening while being framed with Florida heat lightning going on in the background made for an intimidating sight. The beast took a bite from one of the snakes. It swallowed and then let go a roar. Next, it moved in a direction which was away from the approaching men. They kept their lights on it for a few bounds, but then they were searching the darkness for signs of the beast, which was long gone, disappearing into the dark night the way a child gets quickly lost in a crowd of adults. In short, there was simply too much darkness for their capable flashlights to accomplish the goal. The beast was in the wind. I recognized his team, while still enjoying the advantage of numbers, was, if anything now, the hunted, not the hunter. Animals enjoy a distinct advantage over human beings when in nighttime situations. This was true of even when night vision was available. The only exception, perhaps, would be when heat-seeking infrared type stuff was in use. And even then, you would want to involve drones and the use of an above-the-landscape approach to finding the target. There are just too many places which can hide the heat from a large body. A big tree trunk is exactly the sort of thing which hides heat off a body, and Sasquatch is well known for hugging the trunks of trees. Just because I had never encountered the skunk ape didn't mean he hadn't done his homework. Anytime you enter a location, it is wise to become aware of the local wildlife. Failure to do so is amateurish. And I was no amateur. He was well aware of the bears, cats, reptiles, and yes, even the legend of skunk apes being out in the glades. If not so many dangerous creatures, how would he ever have been able to afford so many acres? They practically gave him as many acres as he wanted as long as they were all out in some swampland. So I purchased as much as he could get until he felt he had enough land surrounding his homestead as would be needed to ensure that if anybody ever tried to flank his place, they would not likely make it past the local dangerous critters. Of course, skunk apes were not something he ever expected to encounter. Most men and women would have been in a surprise shock, if not actual shock, from the experience. These veterans of battle were not overwhelmed by their encounter. Instead, their curiosity was aroused. None of them showed any sign of cowardice despite seeing something which wasn't supposed to exist and that obviously was far superior in strength and ability. Had they chosen to track the beast, they quite likely would have walked into an ambush where their technology worked against them. As you read this, keep in the back of your mind the sight of that mighty beast standing there with those huge deadly pythons wrapped around each arm, with the lightning striking in the background and it letting loose a roar into the dark sky, daring anyone and anything to come and take its plunderer away. To anyone hearing that roar, the whole effort was rhetoric. One thing about all this new technology which allows humans to see in the dark is that it can quickly work against you if you are involved in any sort of situation where close-up struggles happen or other members of your team have switched to using flashlights. Then you can suddenly find yourself blinded by the very tech which was supposed to make it possible to see. II recognizes that fact and wisely chose to not pursue a circumstance which might end up getting his team killed or injured. They continue to this day to practice their trade in such a manner that has been presented to you, but in all their times, that night was the only encounter they ever had with the Sasquatch involving the pythons. It was not the only time they had an encounter. On nights sitting around with a cold beer in hand, the talk often turns to the impressive sight of that big beast standing up there while holding out both arms, which were wrapped in those big python bodies, and watching it crush their serpent heads, and then letting go that Tarzan-shaming roar which announced to the world that he was the king of this jungle and let nobody think different. This was the first of several adventures that II and his team have had while in the Florida Everglades. Please subscribe and stay tuned for more of II's adventures, as I will make them available when possible. Thanks for visiting. Godspeed to all.